Verse-by-verse commentary. Verse 1. So let us beware, lest any of you should seem to fall short of entering into his rest by casting aside God's promise in a manner similar to the Exodus generation. Hebrews 4:1. So, the Greek conjunction, aun, indicates a conclusion here based upon what preceded in chapter 3. For this reason, that is, on account of the negative example of the Exodus generation who were unable to enter the land of promise because they were unfaithful and disbelieving. The appeal Paul gives the Jerusalem believers in this verse is based directly upon what he had just said. This is important for modern readers to note, since we all probably have a tendency to think of chapters in the Bible as self-contained units, whereas in fact, of course, chapter divisions in both Testaments are relatively recent inventions. The New Testament chapter and verse divisions with which we are all familiar were devised respectively by Stephen Langton in the 13th century and Robert Estienne in the 16th century. These are very helpful markers for us all, but it is a mistake to think that there is anything inspired about them. We all need to be aware that sometimes such divisions can impair our sense of the flow of the argument in any Bible passage where the sense continues after a chapter break, if we pause, for example, between reading chapters. This passage is a good example, because the division here between chapters 3 and 4 is particularly unfortunate. Everything Paul says here in chapter 4 is predicated upon the argument he has just made in chapter 3, and he would have counted on his readers not pausing at this badly chosen and arbitrary breakpoint. Let us. Paul uses the first-person plural cohortative, which includes himself, let us, to soften the command here and to introduce it more as an encouragement rather than as a direct rebuke. Paul was aware that there was much in this epistle that would be hard for this church to take. He wants his readers to respond and not to become discouraged, comporting himself towards them like a loving father who wants his children's conduct to be corrected, but does not wish to embitter them unnecessarily. Fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. Ephesians 6:4. Fathers, do not embitter your children, or they will become discouraged. Colossians 3:21. Seem to fall short. Paul is being indirect here, that is, by saying, let us beware lest any seem to fall short, rather than saying, don't fall short you all, for two reasons. First, as mentioned above, he hoped that this way of putting things would make the bitter pill of being compared to the Exodus generation go down a bit easier. Second, it is also true that since we are often not entirely sure about ourselves when it comes to evaluating spiritual matters, 1 Corinthians 4:3-5, how much less then can we be confident about ascertaining the spiritual state of other believers? To be sure, we can see what they do and say, and Paul's conviction that many, if not most, in the Jerusalem church were in fact in grave spiritual danger was founded upon good evidence, no doubt reported to him by many visitors and correspondents. Paul is certain enough that he himself, at any rate, is not on the road to apostasy or the sin unto death, for he says, lest any of you. But in terms of individual believers at Jerusalem, he obviously will not have had the complete picture of every single one. And it is also true that there is sometimes a disconnect between our words and actions on the one hand and what is really going on in our hearts on the other. The former are seldom independent of the latter, however, and every believer needs to remember that we are being watched at all times, not only by the Lord and the elect angels, but by our fellow believers and unbelievers alike. Keeping our witness above reproach is important not only for reasons of avoiding hypocrisy, but also to further the kingdom of God. Paul was no doubt hoping, based upon the previous wonderful witness given by this church in years past, that this dangerous behavior of many in going back to the law and of some in delving into Gnosticism was merely an aberration and a correctable mistake. His qualification here is meant for those who have not fully joined in these serious errors, and for those who will yet be willing to respond to his spirit-filled words, accepting the rebuke and reforming their behavior. Remember the days gone by, when you first saw the light, when you persevered through that terrible trial of abuse. For you were publicly exposed to humiliation and persecution and shared the lot of others who experienced the same. You suffered from my chains and accepted the confiscation of your belongings with joy because you knew that you possessed a more valuable estate and a more lasting one. So do not throw away this conviction of yours. It leads to a great reward. Hebrews 10:32 through 35. Casting aside God's promise. What does it mean to fall short of entering into his rest and to cast aside the promises of God? In the Greek text, the latter is the predicate for the former. That is to say, overlooking and neglecting God's promises leads to failure in faith rest. Properly motivated believers move forward. We are motivated by the rewards to come on the other side of this life, the resurrection, the reunion of the entire bride of Christ, the eternal crowns and other rewards we will receive for our stalwart service to the Lord in this life, the offices we will occupy in the Lord's millennial kingdom, and our place and life eternal in New Jerusalem. God has promised us all these things if we but remain faithful to the one who has done everything for us in Jesus Christ. Now, without faith, it is impossible to please God. For whoever wishes to draw nearer to God must believe that he exists and that he will reward those who earnestly seek him. Hebrews 11:6. By faith, Abraham, when he was called by God, obeyed and went forth into the place he was destined to receive as an inheritance. He went forth, moreover, in ignorance of where exactly he was heading. By faith, he sojourned as an alien in the land he had been promised, dwelling in tents with Jacob and Isaac, co-heirs of this same promise. For he was waiting for the foundation of that city, that is, the New Jerusalem, whose architect and builder is God. Hebrews 11:8 through 10. By faith, Moses, when he grew up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, and chose instead to suffer maltreatment with the people of God rather than to enjoy the transitory pleasures of sin, because he considered the reproach suffered on behalf of Christ greater riches than all the treasure vaults of Egypt, for he was looking to his reward. Hebrews 11:24 through 26. Whenever we lose sight of this eternal perspective, whenever we lose focus in the Christian life, we tend to drift rather than maintain our spiritual momentum. And drifting eventually, if not necessarily immediately, generally results in moving sideways and then moving backwards. When that happens, not only has the person so affected forgotten to keep God's promises firmly in mind, but he or she has come to regard them as of little import compared to the things of this life and this world. Then, for the sake of pursuing happiness in a secular way on the one hand, or avoiding trouble because of our faith on the other, said individual may actually come to the point of casting aside these most valuable promises, thinking and speaking and acting as if they were meaningless. When this happens, said individual will find him or herself testing God and grieving the Lord in the very same manner as the Exodus generation did, failing to enter the day-by-day rest we are offered, which provides the necessary peace to make it through this world in a godly way, seeking substitutes in this world instead. This was precisely the status of some large number of the Jerusalem church in returning to the law for security or embracing Gnosticism for worldly pleasure. But he who received the seed on stony places, this is he who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy, yet he has no root in himself, but endures only for a while. For when tribulation or persecution arises because of the word, immediately he stumbles. Matthew 13:20 and 21. These likewise are the ones sown on stony ground, who, when they hear the word, immediately receive it with gladness, and they have no root in themselves, and so endure only for a time. Afterward, when tribulation or persecution arises for the word's sake, immediately they stumble. Mark 4:16 through 17. But the ones on the rock are those who, when they hear, receive the word with joy, and these have no root, who believe for a while, and in time of temptation fall away. Luke 8:13. In days soon to come, there will definitely be much tribulation, or persecution?
9.
Because of the Word. Just as the Exodus generation offered a very useful cautionary tale for the believers of Jerusalem of that later day, so both groups should stand as warnings for us upon whom the ends of the ages have come. 1 Corinthians 11:11.